What I wanted to talk to you about today a little bit is operational risk management and how it relates to operational excellence. And is there a changer? Here we go. And so what we see a lot of times as we're implementing operational excellence programs into our factories around the world, I'm the global leader at DuPont for operational risk management. And what I see a lot of times globally is that there seems to be somewhat of a separation between how to create my operational excellence with my business performance. So it's not to say that they're not connected, but a lot of times we see it very siloed. So today we wanted to talk a little bit about how do we break those silos down and how do we look at it in a very general way. So what I want to talk about is really looking at the business performance of my company using operational risk management as a change engine, which includes culture, as the last speakers were talking about, which includes processes, as other speakers have talked about, which includes behaviors and mindsets, as well as management systems. So we want to talk about all of those together. And operational excellence, and I think our view, is implementing those changes in a sustainable and a positive way, and an innovative way. So a quick comment, when we think about innovation, this is a story I like to tell, is all of us who travel, and everyone in this room travels constantly, I'm sure, and one of the things we find is we have suitcases that have little wheels on them. And one of the challenges that's kind of interesting is we've traveled for 10,000, 100,000, 500,000 years dragging suitcases. And I remember sort of shoulder straps. But when did we put those little wheels on suitcases? 15 years ago? I mean, that's pretty amazing considering that we've been around for 500,000 at least, if not more. So what we want to do is we want to think about how innovation plays in this process. We did a global survey where we looked at multiple industries, primarily high-risk, high-hazard industries, oil and gas, manufacturing, transportation, aerospace, aviation, food and beverage, as well as construction. And we interviewed, I think about 60% of the companies we talked to had a global footprint. About 60% also had a turnover of at least $1 billion US, and another 40% out of that 60 had a turnover of at least $10 billion US. So pretty big companies, pretty global. And when we asked those executive directors about operational risk, is really, really quite telling. What we found is that 75% of those asked felt that their business performance was not managing risk well. What do I mean by operational risk? So for me, operational risk isn't just safety, HSE, process safety. It's not just maintenance and reliability. It's not just integrity management. It's not just production line management, making sure my production levels are right. It's not just asset management. It's not just QA, QC, quality assurance, environmental management. It's all of those. So again, how do I manage my risk across my business in an integrated, holistic way? And 75% felt that it wasn't being managed well, which was quite astonishing and quite worrying. And one of the reasons when we dive down is we see that they really are still separating, fracturing, siloing a lot of those operations I just listed out. Two key findings that I think are really, really important. One is they also recognize that they were not devoting enough resources and capabilities to manage risks effectively, and that was actually threatening their right to work, to operate. So that right to operate, includes a lot of things like regulatory compliance, financial advantages, of course, environmental compliance, all of those things. So let's just think about, since we're all from the manufacturing world in this room, when 9/11 occurred in the US, and I'm sure you read about this in the news, but just to refresh your memory, the US decided they didn't know what happened, And so they didn't close the borders, but they started inspecting cargo going across the Canadian and Mexican border. They used National Guard troops. They did it for 5 days. So it didn't stop the flow, but it slowed it down so much that critical parts from Canada into the state of Michigan, right on the border, into Detroit, into the automotive manufacturing industry, did not reach it in time. So what happened is a number of automotive factories shut down for 30 days and laid off people for 30 days in the middle of this problem because they didn't get the right parts at the right time. So as we've been talking about just-in-time manufacturing, which is still a term that we're still grappling with, how do we balance the risk of just-in-time across multiple borders? I think it's important as we're looking at holistic risk is thinking about Europe right now and the changes going on here from a regulatory perspective with Brexit, migration, border controls. All of those are adding different types of uncertainty that we need to take into our calculation. The other statistic, the other piece that was interesting was the disconnect, the organizational disconnect of what is a risk, what is an operational risk, and how does my team from top to bottom, CEO, shop floor, process line, understand that risk and how to manage it. So we'll dig into a little bit of these two findings, but very, very important because those, again, are cultural issues that become important. I think the last two speakers made the comment about everyone taking advantage of what it is and what they're supposed to do and who is responsible. That responsibility and accountability is key for operational excellence. So I want to hit on to three things. I want to look at sort of what impacts operational risk. And one is we've seen that as the risk profiles of companies are changing, companies aren't always changing as fast. So it becomes really important as we're thinking about what companies existed before, what exists right now. When we look at smartphones, very different landscape right now than it was with the inventors of some of the first mobile phones. So it's how do I manage my risk profile in a changing business environment? The second is budget cutting, and that is always going to be an issue, especially as the economy within the EU is starting to rise up again. We're going to see interesting global competition again, but there have been a lot of cuts. They've cut out fat, and a lot of, I think, sort of the lean discussion and other discussions is how do we operationalize that excellence at the right way? The question is, have we cut into the bone? Have we cut too much? How do we decide what we should cut and what not to cut? How does that impact my business performance? And then lastly, and certainly not least, is this alignment of operational view, because as we all know, the discussion, the understanding, and the application that my teams make on the shop floor, in the executive suites, on the sales forces, in the marketing teams, impact how I look at risk. So Socrates, my most favorite philosopher, has a great expression, at least in English, I don't know what it is. In other languages, he says, an unexamined life is not worth living. So I believe that too, so let's talk a little bit about what DuPont has gone through. So in 2015, we sold off, we divested our Chemours business, which is the bulk of our chemical business. And so a lot of people know DuPont because of our chemical business. When we divested it, we went through significant changes in our risk profile. It was a difficult divestiture. It was worldwide. We had a lot of different challenges going through it. We changed the DNA of our company, of how we thought of ourselves. So that divestiture was part of our reconfiguration of our DNA, which is we wanted to move more into a sciences company. So it had a certain amount of risk. You know, DuPont is 215 years old. So we started off selling gunpowder, of all things. And certainly we've diversified into a lot of areas. What's important is that we had to change with the times as well, which led to the second thing is the Dow-DuPont merger, which is a massive merger and spin, as we call it. Massive change in our risk profile of what does that mean. Putting the two companies together has changed our revenue scheme to about 85 billion in annual turnover a year, so massive. And what we did is we didn't merge the two cultures that are radically different. We call it a merger of equals. But we've put them into 3 divisions. And we will spin off into 3 separate companies that will be on the stock exchanges as separate entities, totally unrelated. One is the agricultural company that will be end-to-end agricultural products from GMOs to seeds, to crops, to pesticides, to whatever. Another will be materials, which will be very focused on materials development. And the third is specialty products, that we call it, as we're thinking of the new name. 24 months to spin them off. Imagine the challenges we're facing. So when I go to a global office, I find out we have people from the different businesses in the same real estate. How do we change that? How do we change the legal entities? How do we manage sort of the migration and the regulatory environment? All of those things affect my operational picture, affect my risk profile that I need to take into consideration. The companies that we've seen that have not succeeded, that have failed around the world in each of our countries, is we've seen have not been able to adapt to those changes. And in fact, you can even say it's generational now. So we're seeing a lot of Generation Y versus baby boomers and sort of those challenges with that aging workforce and the new workforce coming in. Different mentality, different challenges. Cutting to the bone. So this is an interesting statistic, and I know everyone here is in the manufacturing, but as it's important when we benchmark, we don't want to benchmark just against ourselves, because we want to be innovators. So we need to benchmark against other companies, other industries, other things that we've learned. I find this really fascinating, that at the, this actually goes out much further to the mid-70s, but at the bottom of each drop in the price of oil, like we're hitting right now, the severity of catastrophic accidents shoots up. I published a book on risk assessment in 1997, and I talked about catastrophic accidents. And I just updated it in 2015, and I was shocked 17 years, 18 years later, that the number of accidents, lost time injuries globally has gone down, which is wonderful, but the severity of large-scale catastrophic accidents has gone up. So when we're talking about a disaster, we're talking about a multinational disaster, a reputational disaster. And I won't talk to you of the different companies that have suffered from reputational damage because of failures in quality control, failures in production levels. And so again, this is that second point. We want to think about what does it mean to cut, and how do we decide how much we should cut versus too much? A couple more statistics, very interesting, was about this alignment I was talking about earlier. Is we found really high percentage of people, of 86% of our responders, do not believe that senior executives are well aligned to their top operational risks. Very, very interesting. So we're finding frontline staff, and actually this goes along with it. 96% of the respondents felt that frontline operators didn't understand risks. I mean, what does this tell me from a cultural perspective? I mean, when I start unpacking it, it tells me that my executives see risk a certain way, which is logical. They're looking at financial health of the company. They're looking at the enterprise. They're looking at the marketplace. They're looking at competitive things than my frontline staff. Different risks, absolutely. Integrity management on the process line on the shop floor is very different than managing multiple companies, multiple subsidiaries around the world. But when I'm talking about managing risk, when I'm implementing operational excellence programs to lift up, to neck down, to reduce, to increase different parts of my production, am I using the same language for all people? I mean, am I really using different languages for different audiences? So it becomes very critical that we start using language for the appropriate audience and what we wish to accomplish. And so those different layers of management, those different layers of activities become really important in how we look at how risk is managed, and therefore the success of our operational excellence programs. So what we feel really strongly, and in the introduction, mentioned that I have about 30 years plus, and I've worked around the world in a lot of different industries. I've worked in manufacturing, in a lot of the beauty products industries. I've worked in oil and gas. I've worked in space with NASA and the European Space Agency and others. And one thing that we found when we look at these different industries and what is a best practice and a best way is the importance of really looking at combining in one fell swoop the concept of business performance, understanding risk to that business performance, and understanding and enabling my organizational culture to go through. The analogy I like to give is it's like a rug and a weaving. And so what we see, what a lot of companies are doing, they're still very, very siloed. So in our survey, we found that HSE and process safety are discussed in one forum. Business excellence, operational excellence are discussed in other forums. And we're seeing integrity management in a separate forum. So when we're discussing it in a siloed way, how can we ensure that my business performance is linked to understanding those risks to my business objectives that I'm reporting to shareholders, and that my organizational culture is enabling me to do that? And so for DuPont, Sustainable Solutions, a big lesson learned for us was we want to link the business performance, the objectives, what I report to my shareholders, what I report to my board, to risks and operational excellence. We want to understand what's the risk to not meeting that business objective. When I talk to a CEO or a COO, the language I want to use is, are you meeting your business performance objectives? That's language that he or she understands intimately. So what are the risks to that? There are process line risks, there are bottleneck risks, there are distribution risks. There's a great story of a great European company that suffered when one of the earthquakes occurred in the Mediterranean, if you guys remember, about 20 years ago. It flattened their operations at one of their plants. Within 30 days, they were able to reproduce all of their production and distribution in other plants in Europe and go out. So the fact of how the modularity of their production and packaging lines were set, they were able to redistribute very quickly and therefore had much less risk in the marketplace. So it becomes important to understand how to manage those risks as it relates to performance. But the enabler or disabler is my culture. Culture is a word like love. You know when you have it, you know when you don't. And that's about as best we can define it many times. But it isn't just demonstrating leadership commitment, it's living leadership commitment. I was doing a culture review of a company based in Europe a few years ago that had a number of 7 or 8 different subsidiary companies. And I went to one of the subsidiary companies. We were looking at how do I discuss risk at my different levels between the decentralized portion and the board. And it was interesting, one of these companies, when they were discussing risk, it was great on paper. So they had a great risk management program. They were really, really first class. But their leadership weren't seen. The population of the company didn't know their leadership. So whatever they said, over their head. It didn't really have impact, didn't have real meaning. So part of that organizational culture is enabling the success of my operational excellence programs through understanding my operational risks as linked to my business performance. That becomes really important as I try to advance into becoming more and more innovative in this highly competitive world. How do we do it? I'll say that we focused on sort of 4 areas when we want to look at innovation and continuous improvement. One is And again, using that weaving, I think analogy is important, because you don't want to look at these separately and independently and in silos, because again, that's what the problem is. We're looking in silos. I do agree and like bottom-up analysis, but I also think it's critical to look at top-down and also horizontal. So how do I do that when our processes are becoming overly complex? So I was talking with some companies recently in Australia, and in different manufacturing fields, different from food to others, and they were talking about that they feel that they've overcompensated how many processes, management processes they have. So the discussion is, how do I see what's important through the noise? How do I see the forest through the trees? Because I've lost it. So one is to look at that processes and technology that are in place that enable it. So what do I have as an infrastructure that's supporting where I want to go? The second, at governance and management, is how am I managing these processes and technology? Again, they can't be separated. They're really together. The third is, do I have the capability in-house to build it, or can I bring in capabilities? So in other words, are my teams really staffed up to do what those processes require to meet the requirements of my programs globally, locally, regionally? And then also the cultural, the mindsets and behaviors. So again, this is a little bit like love. We know when we have it, we know when we don't have it. But mindsets and behaviors actually has gone into a lot of scientific thought and has become very, very important, and has gotten into a lot of very, very interesting research. And one of the things that's critical that we're finding is the importance of people understanding at the shop floor, what we call area transformation, of what they need to do, what their swim lanes are, of how they operate, what they can and cannot do. So one of the conversations I have with a lot of clients is they'll say, everything is going wrong because people aren't following the rules. And it's very easy to blame it on people. But the question I have is, were those processes legitimate? Were they in place? Did they make sense? Or are people skipping steps and procedures because they don't make sense? Was the governance system, was the management system, did that make sense? Did it actually fit managing those processes, or was it disconnected? You know, do my people really even understand what they're supposed to do? Do they have that innate capability? Have they been trained? Have they been rewarded to do that? And then, of course, do they care? You know, what is their mindset? So I can't look at it, any of these four separately. I've got to look at them together, because they impact, they pull, they push together. They're truly woven together. So just in summary, I just wanted to remind us that when we look at business, when we look at improving our businesses through operational excellence, let's understand what the risks are as it relates to my business. So I don't want to do operational excellence programs in isolation. I want to see, how do they fit? This is how I sell it to my CEO and board, is how does it fit to meeting business performance and surpassing it? How does it fit into my business strategy as I go global, as I go regional? How does it fit in my business strategy as I'm launching new products constantly? And so that means I need to be looking at how my risk profile is different, how it's changing, how it's different in different countries. Second, I want to align those risk analysis processes with my business objectives. So as I mentioned, complexity, a lot of people worry, we'll just put another management system on top, integrated management systems. It's too much. So the idea is we really need to be thinking about, how do I pull data out of my different data streams so I can have a more holistic view of risk? You know, for me, I was talking with one company in Thailand a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and I was describing risk is like fog, so like Berlin fog that we're seeing in these days. So it's amorphous, it doesn't fit into a black box, it permeates everywhere, it goes underneath things, it goes through cracks. That's what risk is. We think in black boxes. We think as humans in silos, but risk doesn't operate that way. So what we want to do is, as we put our risk processes and analysis and management and operational excellence linked to business processes, we break those silos and we look at risk holistically. Likewise, we want to raise the awareness of what risk is, talk risk, operational excellence with different language to different audiences. So that audiences, if I'm going to have that impact, I've got to use the language of the people I'm working with. Now, I don't mean just talking in French or in German or in Spanish or English, but the cultural language on the shop floor, the cultural language in the country that I'm operating in. If I'm a big, like an American company like DuPont, am I going to operate in Brazil culturally? How do I operate in the Philippines culturally? How do I operate in China culturally? As well as the different layers of management have different cultures too. So when we look at culture, I have a corporate culture, but I also have a regional culture related to the country and language. We also want to look at it horizontally. This, I think, is one of the biggest things that I haven't seen happen worldwide. And that is that taking the lessons learned, and I'm finding in my silos, and sharing it horizontally. So if I've had an accident, or I've had a failure, or my supply chain has been disrupted, I'm going to make some changes. Maybe I'll figure it out to the root cause, and so then I'll broadcast it up that silo. The question is, what other changes should I have horizontally across my company? Should my procurement office have different procurement rules? Should my audit team look at new components as they're auditing? Should they look at fewer components as they're auditing? Those are the type of things we want to look at horizontally. And then what we want to do, of course, is increase the capability of working risk and operational risk management. You know, when we look at operational risk management, a lot of people think of protecting value, which is true. So protecting assets, protecting people, but it's also extracting new value, right? Which is what operational excellence is all about. How do I extract more efficiencies? How do I extract higher production levels? How do I reduce costs? But it's also creating value. So it's protection, extraction, creation. We want to create new value through innovation. And when we understand the risk to meeting those business objectives competitively, on the shop floor, regulatory, reputational, capacity. I mean, for example, in some industries, you have a large cohort of people who are retiring. So I work a lot in the Middle East, and I can tell you a lot of the oil and gas companies there have a large cohort of people that are retiring in the next few years. So that new cohort that's coming in, are they prepared? In the US, the Federal Aviation Administration, who does inspection of all commercial airliners and air jets that fly in and out of the US, same situation. Large group that are retiring and a smaller group of young people coming in. How do I manage that change? So I've got to get that capacity up. So I think bringing all these pieces together in a woven type concept rather than a siloed concept is a way to really focus on a sustainable operational excellence, but using operational risk management, the integration of all the different types of risks along my entire value chain is what is going to give me sustainable solutions, which are going to give me innovative solutions, which is going to increase the market share. So I just want to invite people. I think in half an hour at 1 o'clock, we're doing a roundtable discussion where we'll break this down a little bit, and it'll be a smaller group, very hands-on, where we'll look at a couple of risks that different companies have, and what are different ways to address this problem that we're talking about here. I've been speaking about a little bit more theoretically, so I definitely ask you or invite you to attend, and hopefully you can bring your box lunch or whatever is there, and we can talk and eat at the same time, and hopefully share some experiences. So I want to thank you very much, and thank you for your attention, and that's it. Any questions?
Right, I think we have time for one question.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very, very stimulating address. I really enjoyed that. I was very interested in what you had to say about the merger between DuPont and Dow. And what I think you said is that those two very big global companies had different cultures. So when you created 3 different companies out of those 2 mammoth global businesses, did you find that there was any legacy issues relating to their culture, or did they come to have, given obviously regional differences, their own separate culture as a result of that merger?
So that's a great question. I'll give you the answer in 24 months when we finish the spin. We're just starting it now. As you know, we announced the merger a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. So we've been working on it. So now we officially merged the 1st of September. So purposely, we didn't want to try to force fit 2 very old companies and 2 very successful companies, but we wanted to quickly move into where they're going to be. So your question about legacy issues, yes, there will be. Absolutely. I mean, legacy IT issues, legacy HR issues of how to manage HR, how to do employee assessments, how innovation is looked at. And that's why we're putting them into these 3 divisions now so that they can start operating as 3 companies, but within the Dow-DuPont umbrella. So they have some protection to work out those challenges, because absolutely challenges. I mean, I think this merger is unique, and we're going to make it successful. We're going to do everything we can to make it successful. It's not the only big merger we're seeing in the industry around. Other questions?
Okay, I'm afraid that's us out of time. Nicholas will be available, as he says, at the round table in about half an hour. You can pick up any further questions. Can you show your appreciation of Nicholas?
Thank you.